Thanks everyone for joining today. My name is Chuck Cavins, Senior SC over at Crowdstrike. Joining me, if you just saw him speak there a few minutes ago, is, I'll let you introduce yourself.
I'm Michael Grave, and I will be heckling.
Yes, he's caller commentary. He is a comedian actually, so he'll be making fun of me the entire time. But so today we wanted to cover a couple of topics. In the brief there over lunch, a lot of people were talking about advanced threats, TTPs, that a lot of the advanced adversaries are using. So a few of the things we want to cover today, I'm trying not to PowerPoint you guys to death. I'm sure you guys have seen a few of those today. So what I want to do is kind of cover a couple of different types of adversaries that we track, some of their TTPs, and then actually go more into a live attack demonstration and show you guys some of the real world attacks that we're seeing on a daily basis out there during our incident response, breach investigations, and so forth. So I stole this from our CEO, George Kurtz, but he asks people this question all the time. Are you more interested in stopping a piece of malware or stopping a breach, right? And because really, as we know, and a lot of the speakers over there were speaking about this specifically, is if you look at all the breaches that everyone has investigated for the last 12 years or so, there's really one thing that they have in common. When we look across all of those data breaches, pretty much every organization out there has their firewalls, they have their AV, they've been sandboxing, they've been using their IPS and whitelisting, etc. And there's a reason why all of these are failing, and that's kind of what I want to show you guys today, is the techniques that these adversaries are using that bypass a lot of these techniques, right? Signature-based, blocking known bad websites, where obviously those are great technologies, and I wouldn't recommend removing your firewall or your AV or sandboxing solutions and so forth. But what we find, and I'll kind of drill into these particular stats that we've pulled from Verizon breach reports and so forth, is stopping the malware really isn't enough, because that might be the initial implant stage, but as soon as they get in the environment, they want to move away from that malware as soon as possible, and they want to do things from a more advanced perspective, using valid credentials. And the non-malware attacks are seen more and more by the advanced adversaries. So if you look at the right-hand side there, the harder to detect breach, harder to detect tactics and so forth are being used by the nation-state adversaries, the organized crime organizations, and less and less malware is being used by these particular folks. And we'll dig into and show you guys exactly what type of techniques these guys are using and how they're evading your existing security tools today. So we're going to break down 3 different types of adversaries that Crowdstrike tracks today. The hacktivists, e-crime, and then the targeted intrusions, which are typically attributed to those nation-state adversaries. At Crowdstrike here, we have a threat intelligence practice, and we track over 90 adversary groups. You may have heard of our naming convention out there in the wild today. We call the Russians the bears, the China we call the pandas, so something panda like Deep Panda, or if you look at the DNC breach, which we did the breach investigation for, we attributed that to 2 adversaries, Fancy Bear, which if you want to know how we came up with that, I can explain, or Mike maybe have a little more color commentary there, but and Cozy Bear, right? So those are 2 adversaries that we attributed based on the TTPs that we saw in that environment during that attack, and then we'll actually cover some of their types of activity as well today. And so if we look at the hacktivists, typically these guys, they have their goals in life are notoriety, disruption, and financial gain. So they'll deface websites, they'll bring down websites, DDoS attacks against organizations that they don't like, which obviously is a risk, but less and less on the data breach side. So if we look at some of the TTPs that we've observed out in the wild, from a malware perspective, we do see them using Linux implants, reverse shells, etc., so they can get back in the environment. But from a malware-free perspective, what are they doing that's not going to be picked up by your traditional signature-based tools? One of the things that we see is web shells. So using your public-facing web servers to create a shell as a remote backdoor into the environment. And that's actually one of the attacks that I will show you guys today. This one is specifically something we call the China chopper. I don't know if anybody's heard of that particular attack vector, but essentially exploiting a public-facing web server to gain remote access directly through there. And like I said, we'll walk through that particular one. Some of the other things that they're using are what we call living off the land. So if I can get a valid set of credentials, I can move laterally via RDP, move around to the different servers in the environment that contain the data that I want, right? And then if I use out-of-the-box Windows tools like WMI or PowerShell, how are you guys in your environments tracking that usage? Who's using it? How often is it being run? And more importantly, what is it actually doing to the systems? So if you see a PowerShell script, did that PowerShell script dump credentials? Did it install remote software? You know, really understanding the behavior of how these tools are being run in your environment, and you know, is it being used for known good system administration, or is this an adversary that's kind of flying under your traditional signature-based radar? So the next is e-crime. Everyone's kind of talking about ransomware. I know it's a big thing here in the state. And our guys from TrendMicro actually covered quite a bit of this in their a little bit more detailed slide. But what are we actually seeing the ransomware doing to the system? So one of the issues with ransomware is they obfuscate it. It's using old vulnerabilities, right? Unpatched vulnerabilities from, say, 9 years ago, like they mentioned. But when we're analyzing these particular pieces of ransomware, we're really looking at the behavior. You know, what are they doing to the system when they get in? And one of the key things that a lot of ransomware is doing before it executes is actually deleting your backup files. So it hits the system, it'll run VSS admin, WMIC, or even registry keys to disable system restore, and then it'll actually delete your backups before encrypting that device, right? So if you had a valid backup, what's the purpose of encrypting if I can just hit one button to restore? So we're trying to really focus on the behavior of these tools to see if we see this behavior in the wild. Some unknown executable has hollowed out explorer.exe, it's injected itself and overwritten that process's memory, and then it launches those sub-processes like WMIC or VSS admin to delete those backups. That's essentially the first part there.
So Chuck just mentioned something that I think is pretty important to understand and to recognize. He described how ransomware works in general, and that's across all the various families of ransomware. You can't have a successful ransomware attack from the attacker's point of view unless your target cannot easily recover his files, right? That's a fundamental characteristic of ransomware or any kind of ransom attack, which if you can identify and stop that from happening, then you can interrupt the attacker's kill chain and strike out an entire class of attacks, not just a family of a ransomware malware family or something like that. That concept's pretty important because if you can, as a defender, identify what are the things that attackers are trying to succeed at in your environment and then keep them from succeeding at that thing, whatever that thing is, then you can deliver asymmetric pain to your adversary, right? You can make it harder for them to succeed using tools that make it easier for you to defend your network. That's an inversion of the typical tools advantage in an attack defense scenario.
Yeah, so like I said, we do see them hollowing out known good processes, right? Explorer.exe, SVC hosts are typically the ones they'll hollow out in order to perform these types of actions. Now, moving on to probably the scariest of the adversaries and probably our main focus from our threat intelligence perspective is looking at the advanced nation-state targeted intrusion. These guys are, they do intel work for a number of different reasons. At the DNC, they were going after, voter political information, trying to sway our country's presidential election one way or another. They may also be, organizations that are coming after intellectual property, or they may come after, like OPM, for example, going after how healthcare is structured and a lot of information there. So they have a different set of goals, but what we see more and more is they're still using, actually I'll switch to the next one here. a combination of maybe malware to get into the environment, but once maybe they dump credentials, they'll use living off the land again, right? They're looking at what can I use that's already present on the system, so I don't have to drop any executables, I don't have to get flagged by the malware engines. If they're using application whitelisting in this environment, it doesn't matter because I'm using a signed Microsoft executable that's on their whitelist, so it's going to kind of fly under the radar, right? And so we definitely see spear phishing for credentials. No mechanism for delivering malware or compromised or vulnerable web document, weaponized Word documents or anything along those lines. They may send an email out and say, hey, you get a raise, click on this link, and when you click on that link, you go and type in your username and password, right? And once the user does that, that adversary now has valid credentials in your environment, which allows them to come back in, move around laterally, use those tools. Hopefully it wasn't one of your domain admin accounts or, an administrator account that they have stolen, but once they do that, it really gives them the keys to the kingdom there.
So I'll point out that when I was working at Netscape and we got acquired by AOL in like 1999, that precise technique was one of the biggest problems that AOL internal security faced, was internal employees getting their credentials phished by external actors who wanted to get an internal credential that they could use to try to access the credit card database. So if you guys remember the big the AOL credit card hacks from the early 2000s, that was all happening because of a spear phishing credential stealing attack by just standing up a web server that looked just like I think it was employee benefits was one of the incidents. You would go and you'd sign in with your username and password to get at your benefits, right? Obviously, everybody does that. Yeah, it's super effective because people will still do that today. That's I hate to say it, but it's probably never ever going to change.
Yep. So I wanted to cover a couple of those attack techniques. So I'll one at a time. I'll kind of talk about these and then actually roll into a real world. I got a couple of virtual systems running, and we can exploit the web server and show you guys the capabilities that these tools will give the adversary once they're able to perform these actions. So in most of these cases, when we do find these particular entry points or whatever it may be, these adversaries are typically living in the environment for over a year. So specifically at the DNC, well over a year, right? It was like 400 and something days they were in the environment before they knew that they were there, which gives them a lot of time to do reconnaissance and browse the entire environment, figure out exactly what they want. And as you saw, what was posted to the internet was essentially everything, right? They had access to all those servers, emails, chats, as you guys probably heard in the news. So the first one here is what we refer to as the China chopper, because there's a few Chinese adversaries that are using this particular attack. And so these 72 characters here are all that are required for an adversary to gain remote access to your environment. And it may not look like much, but this is a web shell attack where they essentially create on your web server, either they have physical access to it or remote access to it, and they can create this web shell directly under the IIS server, for example. Or in this case, I'm actually going to use a vulnerable web app that's going to allow us to create that from the outside. And essentially, when this is created, it gives them all sorts of access. Remote command prompt, it's going to give them file browsing activities, it's going to give them remote database administration of the database that's underlying under IIS, and a number of different things, which we'll actually show you. I'll break out into that right now. So here's the actual web server itself. Just on the default website here, we can explore. You'll see that there's just a couple of, this is my vulnerable app that I'm actually going to exploit. And you'll notice that there's 2 folders and 2 files here. So what I'm going to do is now I'm connected to that vulnerable app, and I'm going to take those 72 characters, and I'm going to go ahead and submit that. One might take about 30 seconds or so for it to create, but nope, not even that fast. So now you just see externally, I just created this webshell.aspx file. That was not there 10 seconds ago, right? And so if we edit this, it's just those 72 characters, right? 72 byte ASPX file sitting on your web server. Now, if we go to our chopper tool, which is the executable that allows us to exploit that, we're going to go ahead and open that up. Let's go ahead and, I was making sure it worked earlier, obviously, before we do this live. But so what all the attacker has to do from the outside now is go ahead and put in the IP address and site, right, webshell.aspx. And from there, what they can do is say, I want to launch a virtual terminal. Now, I'm connected to that webshell.aspx, and it gives me a full virtual terminal with NT authority system privileges from the outside of your environment, right? So essentially, just connecting to that web shell. Who in this room could tell me if any of those web shells exist on any of your IIS servers? Probably not. Who's monitoring that, right? How do you know that that's a bad web shell? I'm running as NT authority system. That allows me, you know, say I wanted to create a net user, call them, let's create my name here, right? Oh, I didn't type in the password, but you know, I have local admin rights. So I essentially can create backdoors, create local administrator accounts. I can also, if I wanted to use this, I can now start creating additional web pages maybe on this web server. So now I have access to an internal web server where I'm controlling it. What if I did a spear phishing campaign that sent an email that made you connect to this internal web server now? And I asked for your username and password. I could set up my phishing campaign directly from here. And which user would not trust an internal web server, right? So just by that technique, this is exactly what we're talking about with malware free. I haven't dropped any executables, no malicious DLLs. I've done nothing but add a single ASPX file to this web server, and I've essentially owned that machine. This one happens to be a domain controller too in my lab, so I could do all sorts of things like create you know, domain administrator accounts and all sorts of interesting.
Find some hashes, maybe?
Yeah, dump some hashes, maybe run Mimikatz, you know, dump all the credentials on the domain controller, something that, you know, domain controllers are obviously very high value targets. But these are some of just one of the examples that we're seeing how the advanced nation state adversaries are getting into these environments. They're maintaining persistence. Now, anytime they want, they just connect to that web shell and essentially have a backdoor into your environment. Right.
So one of the interesting, so there's a trend running with this tactic as well. China Chopper used to be ironclad evidence that China was up in your business because they were only the Chinese threat groups were the ones who were using it. But today it's going much wider market. As Chuck showed, it's pretty easy. It's pretty easy to use. You can find the source code out there. You can no longer make the inference that just because the Chopper web shell's on a system, that it must be China. This leads to an interesting situation in a response where if you can find Chopper running, and we can, we'll talk a little bit about how we can identify that, right? If you can find Chopper running in the environment, then looking at what the adversary is doing with that access, that actually gives you information as a responder about who your adversary might be. And the information about who he might be is interesting because it tells you what his other capabilities might be.
Yeah, so one other thing I wanted to show you guys, some other possibilities with that China Chopper shell. So that was a virtual terminal, but I'm running as NT authority system, so I can essentially have all the privileges I want. It also gives you a full file management, so if you had any sensitive data on that particular server, it gives you an upload and download capability, so you can upload any file you want, drop any executable, drop additional websites on there, but if you just wanted to browse through the entire directory, for example, it gives you that full process, right? So I have program files, I have my SQL server on here, maybe I start grabbing databases. You can go directly down and actually download that file, for example. It also gives you the ability to do remote wgets, so you can do a wget from that site and have it go out and grab anything you want from the internet and drop it in that folder. A number of different capabilities that it gives the user. It also gives them remote management, so database management. So if they want to actually manage your database, your underlying database, they can make permissions changes, they can lock you out. Depending on what their goals are, they have full access to the system now. And so it's kind of an interesting way that we've seen them get into the environment. I don't want to talk too much about product here, but one of the things that we've done is with our tools is be able to identify this type of activity, prevent this type of activity in the environments. If you looked at the processes that were involved in this particular attack, it's simply a command prompt that's launching under the W3 worker process. So in your environment, which tools would, and there's actually people who do that legitimately. I don't know why, but
Oh, I know why.
yeah.
But let me actually draw that back to something else. You know, a minute ago we were talking about if ransomware is going to succeed, then you have to delete the backups, right? In order for a web shell, whether it's China Chopper or there's a whole bunch of other ones, in order for any of these web shells to succeed, they have to be able to execute code underneath the web server process. That's the common thing, the common TTP that you can look for is there something executing under the web server that could be under an external control? Do you have a shell running underneath a web server? Most most well-designed business systems don't have that. Yep. Now I roll my eyes a little bit because I did actually have a client where we were doing incident response where they had a business process that depended on the web server forking a shell, creating accounts in the Active Directory, and then assigning privileges to those accounts. And if that doesn't smell evil, I don't know what does. It turned out to be that part turned out to be a legitimate business process, and we had to help them figure out how they could kind of pull the tangled hair apart to get their relatively poorly designed business process out of the attacker activity. And so they could just focus their analysis on what was the attacker doing. You know, let's not pay attention to the provisioning system.
Yep. And just to note, I'm doing this on an IIS server on Windows, but we've seen these capabilities exist on Apache on Linux, Apache on Windows, which we don't see that too often in the wild.
CGI is basically a web shell.
Yeah.
Web shell
yeah. So it's across all platforms, across all types of web servers. So.
And there was a really sexy remote code execution patch for Exchange Server last week or the week before in this month's batch that answered for me. I wonder how all these web shells are getting on these Exchange front-end servers that we're having to deal with, where we couldn't find an obvious point of entry. One of the frustrating things in incident response is sometimes you can't figure out how the web shell got there. You just know what it's doing once you can find it. There are one way or another in order to get a web shell on a machine, you've got to be able to write code or write file contents on the endpoint.
So one of the other types of activities, there's another one I can show you if we have time, but another type of attack that we're seeing is the use of PowerShell, right? People using PowerShell, if you guys are Exchange shops, you pretty much have to have it, so for administration. And so the adversaries are moving more and more away from dropping executables and running them if they can perform the same action within a whitelisted application like this particular one. And I'm actually going to run this against my system. I have this particular command here. So this is what they're doing with this PowerShell commands. A few interesting things you'll note about these particular commands is the first one I'm running in a hidden window, so it doesn't pop it up on the end user system. I'm going to bypass the execution policy, and then I'm also going to encode the commands with, this one's just base 64 encoded, which is pretty basic. We do see them using, custom XOR and things along those lines. So this, you can just go and Google it, right, and figure out exactly what's going on behind the scenes. And the real piece here is, here's the actual script without the actual URL link to the actual PowerShell script in it. That's the redacted part. But it is Mimikatz, right? It's Mimikatz running within PowerShell. And really this is where what we're looking at is less and less about the executable itself and more about what is the behavior. So when this PowerShell script ran, did it hit any of the restricted credential stores that are stored within the operating system? Is that LSAS dumping clear text passwords? Is that the SAM hive? What is this PowerShell process actually doing to my system? Did it write any executables? Did it create DNS requests out to the internet? Did it make network connections? And looking at what the behavior of these tools are, because this is what the adversaries are using, right? They're living off the land. So I'll show you guys a quick example. I have another set of VMs that aren't servers here. So I'll kind of walk through this with you. On the right-hand side, I'll have my victim system. This one's easy enough to do just through my Kali Linux box, just running Metasploit. So in this case, I'm going to be a user in traditional fashion. I'm going to go ahead and click on a link, right? Because no one ever does that, whatever that cool site may be. And now I'm connecting directly to my attacker system here. And something you'll notice here is I'm actually running as notepad.exe on the system. So I'm using no external executables, once again, using all out-of-the-box Microsoft applications to perform this. So I got a couple different sessions with a few different systems here. So I'm going to go ahead and connect to this particular, as soon as I learn how to type. So now I've attached to myself to my victim system. I'm going to go ahead and create a remote shell there. You can see it's system 32, but it'll be real long. So even though I'm a Linux box, I have a remote shell over to the victim system. And the command is too long to type, so I'm just going to copy it right here. So in this particular case, that's the same exact PowerShell command that we saw in the demo there, or in the PowerPoint slide a second ago. And so it usually takes about 10 or 15 seconds, depending on this wonderful internet connection.
So you actually just said something that is, again, tactically interesting. You said this command's too long to type, so I'm just going to copy and paste it. There's a really fine line between lazy and efficient. And a lot of the targeted actors they obliterate that line towards efficiency by getting a relatively unskilled group of operators, giving them an SOP manual and saying, here, type these things, or copy and paste these things. When it becomes interesting is when you see a shift in tactics or a shift in the capability of execution. If you can see what the attackers are typing and how they are trying to achieve what they're doing, which we typically try to achieve that visibility in an incident response, you can see the shift from the C team to the B team. And that shift tells you that the attacker is either escalating operations or he may suspect that you're on to him. You can use that information about your attacker recovered from technical systems to make non-technical inferences about their capability.
And so that command, that PowerShell command has completed. And what you'll notice is for my particular system here, what it allowed me to do is there's my user Chuck, my domain that I'm part of. It allowed me to dump my NTLM and SHA-1 hashes for that user. But most importantly, there's my clear text password, right? So now I'm a valid user on the domain. I have a username and password. I can start using tools like RDP to remove through the systems that user has access to. I can start browsing the file shares that user has access to and start collecting data just as if I were a regular user, right? And this is a perfect example of another malware-free tactic that we're seeing out there. If you were to look at the processes that were involved in this, it would be Outlook spawning in Internet Explorer because I clicked on a link, Internet Explorer spawning that notepad process, which I hollowed out and was using as my beachhead, and then I launched my command prompt, and then PowerShell. Those are the 6 processes that were involved by user clicking on a link to get to this particular system, right? And so, like I said before, it's really about what is this particular process doing to my system. Did it create DNS queries? Did it hit those credential stores? Did it write any additional executables? Did it allow the user to move laterally? And having the visibility into those particular processes on your machine to be able to give you that information. Because can anyone in the room tell me actually here. So if you have a process running in your environment, can anyone tell if that process made a particular DNS query per process on the system? Right? These are the pieces of information you have to piece this back together. Because to tell you the truth, I went out to GitHub user content to grab that, right? There's a PS1 file I host on GitHub. But in order to know, you might see that on the firewall or your DNS server, right? But how do you track that back to not only the system that made that call, but the actual process that made that call, which user was it running as, and then what was the other behavior associated with that process?
So that's a set of 6 questions that we ask clients in incident response when one of the leads is, I have this evil domain name. Almost nobody can answer that, right? Because it means like you have to go to the DNS server and then track it back into the DHCPs, which system had that DHCP address? Oh, okay, it was Bob's laptop. Okay, let's see if we can find Bob. Oh, he's in the Bahamas getting rained on. So we'll have to wait until his laptop comes back in order to image it. It's if you can get that information quickly, you can drop the scope of an investigation dramatically fast because you can focus just on, all right, let me work first on all the machines that are known to have accessed this site, which is hosting evil content. I mean, GitHub is not evil,
no.
Right? But your little package that you're hosting on there is, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. We've seen command and control being executed through public DNS servers, through code storage sites like GitHub and other similar ones, through, I think I saw one that used Microsoft TechNet for C2 once,
Yeah.
comments on an article.
Yep.
They were hardly lower signal to noise than other comments on TechNet. But
So there's one other thing that you guys may or may not have seen this out in the wild before, but this is another one that we see quite often still being used by some of the adversaries. It's actually been removed in Windows 10, thankfully, so I can't get your Surface over there, but I could get all the other ones. So if you guys haven't standardized on Windows 10 yet, this is a possibility. So this is one of the ways they maintain persistence in the environment. So even if I didn't have credentials, if I was able to exploit one of your machines and simply run the top if it's done locally, the bottom if I'm using remote management, so I could hit a bunch of different machines in the environment using WMI. But here I'm running reg.exe, right? A standard Microsoft executable to manage the registry. And I'm going to add a key under, HKey local software, Microsoft, whatever it is, osk.exe. So I see a few heads shaking. You've seen this one before. And then I'm going to tell OSK that it's in a debugger mode, which is something that Microsoft called a feature for a long time. And then I'm going to tell it that its debugger is cmd.exe. And that's all I'm doing is creating a single registry key in the environment, right? And so we'll go back to my victim system here. I'll go ahead and lock it. Now I'm the adversary, and I've added this registry key. Oh, thank you, Mike. See, you're here for a reason.
yeah,
So now I'm back
years
to
of computer science.
now I'm back to my victim system here. And say I don't have Chuck's username and password. I've already peed to the box, but I want to gain access to that system to make some changes to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to tell my system that I want to type using the on-screen keyboard. What does that do? Gives me a command prompt with, guess again, NT authority system privileges. So now without authenticating to your device, any machine, we see this being used on domain controllers all the time because then they can come dump the SAM hive and get full access to every domain account in your environment, including your domain admins, enterprise admins, etc. And so,
I got something to add to this.
yeah,
Who
go
here
ahead.
loves logs?
Oh, clear event logs.
I like big logs, and I cannot lie. The no login event log.
No of log, yeah. You haven't authenticated.
Right? Doesn't happen. There's no authentication going on, so you don't have a type 3, a type 1, you don't have a type anything. Yeah, right? It's getting sexier.
So what we see them doing is, say I wanted to, sorry, I can't even see over there.
I'm sorry, you said you can log no login?
This does not create a
No,
log
this does
event
not create an event log entry for a successful login.
because I haven't actually tried to authenticate yet. I've just simply established an RDP connection to the server. So I haven't tried to enter credentials, so there's no failed login attempt, there's no valid login attempt, there's no log in your environment when I try to do this. Not a single Active Directory log created. And so say I wanted to open up the registry, sure I can do that. Say I wanted to, services.msc. I don't like that your firewall's on, I don't like that your AV's on, I don't like that any of your other tools are on. I'm going to go ahead and shut those down without authenticating, right? Because I'm NT authority system, I have more privileges than anyone, right? And so the other thing that we see them doing here is creating local accounts. So then I'll create a local account, maybe called help desk, and then I'll add it to the local admin group, which I have permission to do. And then now anytime I want to log in, I can actually get a desktop by typing in that username and password that I just created for my local admin. So, and so what we're trying to show you guys is that you got to go beyond hunting for malware, right? You have to have logs of every single process that's launching on that are launching in your environment. You have to understand what DNS queries they're being made, but also what are the parent-child relationships? Because you can have a log that command prompt launch, cmd.exe launch, great. What are you going to do with that information? But if you understand the context about what was its parent process, how was it launched? Is this a normal way for command prompt to be launching, or is this a bad way for command prompt to be launching? These are the questions that you need to be able to ask your data, but you have to have something that will give you visibility into all of those processes in order to ask those questions, right? What's going to give you that visibility? It's not going to be a log. Let's see here.
I like to rip on logs a little bit because I had some bad experiences with them in the 90s, but it's not to say that you don't need to continue to collect logs. Application logs are a good source of data, for finding out how applications are being misused after the fact. And there are some good Windows logs. When we do IR, we still will ask to pull all the event logs from as many systems as you can get. All that said, though, there's so much stuff that's really interesting that happens on a Windows system that leaves minimal artifact on the disk, minimal artifact in memory, and no logging in the event logs, that if you have a system to capture it at the time that it happens, which is how we built Falcon Host, then you can go back and review that information later without having to do that tedious step of reconstructing the past from artifacts in the present.
Yeah, so this is a little video that I created the other day based on some of the data that I've logged in my lab, right? And so this is actually Maltego. If you guys are familiar with Maltego, it's a commercially available visualization tool. And we've built some transforms for our APIs for querying. So if you did have questions like this, these are the types of questions that you need to be able to ask your data. So what I'm going to do here, let me move this, it's going to get in the way. This is actually what we call our threat graph database. So this is the back-end infrastructure that we use to log all of the events that are happening in the system. And we open up an API for our customers and for your tools in your environment, so that if you had a domain name that got hit on your DNS server, you can use the API to automatically query and say, hey, show me every machine that's hit this DNS name, or show me every machine that's ran this hash of this executable, right? And give you a 30-day view of exactly what's happened retrospectively in your environment. Because the other issue is, if you do a traditional incident response, if you go to, someone has to ask you a question, has this hash ever ran in my environment? What are you going to do? You're going to start from one end, and you're going to search your entire environment to see if that hash currently exists right now. Do you know if it ever existed? No. Did they use sdelete? Is it gone? Right? So being able to have that retrospective view of everything that happened in your environment and putting it contextually together so you understand if it was being used in a good or a bad way. So I'll kind of talk you through this as it goes through, but essentially, say you guys had a domain in your environment, and you wanted to know, have I ever seen, it's going to be called commandandcontrol.com, have I ever seen this domain in my environment? You can query the data and say, yes, this machine queried that domain. Okay, show me which process on that machine queried that domain. And then you can go and say, okay, give me details about it. What were the hashes? What were the PIDs and so forth? And then you can say, show me other domains that this process queried, right? And then, show me child processes of this particular process. And so what it's really allowing you to do is walk through an attack retrospectively without actually ever touching the endpoint device, right? Because the data already exists in the cloud. So let's query the data. This machine could be re-imaged. The guy could be offline. It doesn't matter. You still have this visibility into everything that's happening on every single one of your workstations. And so, let's go ahead and pull the PID data here and say, show me any other DLLs that process loaded, right? So you get to drill down into it. Show me any or any other domains that this process launched, right? And then you can essentially walk through that graph and say, okay, now I see that this domain has been queried from these two systems in my environment, right? And so it allows you to walk through these attacks. And then this is kind of the part where we integrate our threat intelligence. So we have an API where if you had a domain, a hash, an IP, number of different things, could be an email address from a phishing email you guys saw, you can essentially query our threat intelligence that we've been gathering, and we'll tell you what else we know about it, if there's attribution to specific actors. Is this just a basic botnet domain, or is this a domain that's controlled by a nation-state adversary, right? And so from here, what we can do is say, query this domain for attribution. And the response in this particular case is yes. We know that is a venomous bear, which is a Russian actor. And we actually created a report that includes this one specific piece of information. Well, now maybe you saw this one piece of information, but you want to know what else is included in this attack. Is there other IPs? Are there hashes that make these DNS requests? Give me the full visibility into this particular attack so that I know, not just this one vector, but are there other things that they're going to be coming at me? Other domains that it may be querying out to, or other email addresses that are going to be sending this link into my environment, and that type of thing. So then you can actually query for what we call related indicators, which will allow you to say, yes, we see that one domain in your environment, but here's what else you should be able to look for. Here's the other domains that are attributed to this type of attack from this adversary. Here's the IPs, here's the ports they use, here's the certificate information for their executables, here's their hash information, but really giving you that full picture of an attack, not just playing whack-a-mole and try to block a domain here or block a piece of malware here by hash, really giving you the full context of that attack. And so you understand, all the different ways that you'll be attacked and can protect yourself. Because if you see one in there, they're going to be using others, right? And how do you put that all together?
Watch me pull a blacklist out of my hat.
Yeah.
That trick never works.
Yeah, seriously. So,
Is Rocky and Bullwinkle too old? Like, do I need to stop using that now?
yeah, probably, huh? So that's that's an example of, so a few key things that when we go in to do an incident response, we want this information, right? If you could ask, how long would it take to ask this question in a customer in your environment today, right? So we saw a domain. Which machine queried it? Which process queried it? What other domains did that process query? This would take probably days, right? You'd have to go pull the box. You'd have to pull an image using Encase or something, pull an image down, and spend days combing through that particular disk image to figure out and try to piece all the puzzle, trying to put the puzzle together. And so what we're trying to do is give customers real-time visibility into everything that's happening in their environment, and then build what we call, based on our threat intelligence and what Mike and his team do around the professional services, understand what's normal for these processes, what's abnormal, and then be able to pick out those outliers for you, or if it's maybe specific to credentials, right? Say I did dump those credentials like you saw. Now, where are these credentials being used in the environment? How are they being used? How many machines has these credentials been used to remote into? Once they remoted into those boxes, what did they run? Did they run PowerShell? Did they write executables? Did they browse the web? Essentially trying to piece that entire puzzle together so you guys can ask those questions quickly and understand the scope of an attack. So, yeah.
The transform you're demonstrating,
That's our transform. Yeah.
Yeah, so it goes into an API. The transform operates against an API in our intelligence subscription platform. So
Yep.
it can make queries of the back end.
Yep. Cool. Well, thanks everyone for your time. Appreciate it. Yeah,
One more question.
of course.
Just, I gotta ask.
42.
You guys have made the coolest name I've ever seen for a hacking group.
Which one?
Where did Rocket Kitten come from?
Oh, Rocket Kitten. Yeah, it's that one is because they were hitting some of the defense aerospace areas, and in particular things that were related to rockets. The threat group names are sometimes fanciful and sometimes related to the targets.
Yeah, so we have like Turbine Panda because they were going after specific targets. You could imagine aerospace and so forth. Or if you wanted a report on Rocket Kitten, hit me up and I'll send it over to you. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, thanks everybody for your time. Appreciate you coming today.